Ethan had always taken pride in running a tight ship around his property. Living out in the countryside came with its fair share of challenges, but for him, it was part of the charm. His well was his lifeline, a carefully maintained system that provided water for his home, his garden, and the little things he enjoyed, like his weekend barbecues with perfectly green grass underfoot. So when the water pressure in his house started acting up, Ethan brushed it off at first. Maybe a clogged filter, maybe a minor leak. Nothing he couldn't handle. But as the days dragged on, his patience wore thin. Showers became an exercise in frustration, more like standing under a drizzle than any kind of steady stream. His sprinklers, once powerful enough to cover the entire lawn, sputtered weakly and barely reached the flower beds. Something wasn't right, and Ethan knew it. One bright Saturday morning, mug of coffee in hand, he sat on his porch trying to enjoy the stillness of the countryside. The birds sang, the breeze was gentle, and the scent of fresh-cut grass hung in the air. But the back of his mind wouldn't settle. His gaze wandered lazily across his property, half wondering if he'd missed something obvious. And then he saw it. A long garden hose, thick and coiled like a snake, running from the side of his well straight toward the fence line. Ethan's brow furrowed. He set his coffee down slowly, eyes narrowing as he stood and walked toward the fence. The hose disappeared over the top, its end lost on the other side, right into Todd's yard. Ethan's pulse quickened. Todd. The neighbor who never returned borrowed tools, who always showed up empty-handed to cookouts but left with a plate piled high. The kind of guy who thought favors were a one-way street. But stealing water? That was a new low, even for Todd. Ethan forced himself to take a breath. Maybe there was some explanation. Maybe Todd had asked, and Ethan had forgotten, though that seemed impossible. Maybe it was an emergency. But deep down, Ethan knew exactly what this was. A quiet theft. Bold, sneaky, and insulting. And as he turned back toward the house, his jaw tightened. This wasn't just a trickle from the tap anymore. This was personal. Ethan didn't waste time. His mind was racing with irritation as he crossed the yard, each step making him more certain of what he'd find. Reaching Todd's front porch, he knocked hard enough to echo down the street. The door swung open, and there was Todd, looking as carefree as ever in his wrinkled t-shirt and cargo shorts, a smug grin already plastered on his face. "Hey man, what's up?" he said, like they were old buddies catching up. Ethan didn't smile. He kept his voice calm but firm. "I noticed a hose running from my well into your yard. Care to explain?" For a split second, something flickered across Todd's face, surprise, maybe guilt, but just as quickly, it vanished. He chuckled, leaning against the doorframe as though this was all some harmless misunderstanding. "Oh, that? I figured you wouldn't mind, man. It's just a little water. You've got more than enough, right?" Ethan's fists clenched at his sides. "That's not the point, Todd. You didn't ask. You just took." Todd shrugged, the arrogance practically dripping off him. "I was gonna mention it. Just hadn't gotten around to it yet. Besides, it's not like I'm wasting it. I'm filling the pool now and then, watering the garden. We're neighbors. We help each other out." Ethan's patience was fraying fast. Helping is one thing. Stealing is another. You crossed a line. I want it stopped immediately." Todd smirked, pushing off the doorframe. All right. No need to get dramatic. I'll unhook it later." But the tone in his voice, that condescending, dismissive smugness, told Ethan all he needed to know. Todd had no intention of stopping. That night, Ethan couldn't sleep. The image of Todd standing there, so unapologetic, so sure he could get away with it, gnawed at him. Around midnight, he grabbed his flashlight and quietly made his way out to the back of his property. The night was still, broken only by the distant chirping of crickets. As he reached the well, the beam of his flashlight caught the same hose, still hooked up, still running. His heart pounded as he followed it to the fence. Peering through the slats, he saw Todd lounging in a deck chair, beer in hand, watching his pool fill with stolen water like he didn't have a care in the world. Ethan backed away slowly, forcing himself not to storm over there and make a scene. No, this needed a smarter approach. He pulled out his phone, capturing photos of the hose, the connection, the water streaming into Todd's pool, and even a video of Todd sitting there, perfectly relaxed in the middle of his crime. The next morning, Ethan sat at his kitchen table, scrolling through local water regulation laws. What he found made his blood boil and his resolve harden. Unauthorized use of a private well wasn't just a slap-on-the-wrist offense. It could lead to steep fines, and if Todd had been doing this long-term, he could be facing thousands of dollars in penalties. Ethan gathered everything: photos, videos, even water pressure logs from his smart system. He submitted his report to the local water authority. Later that afternoon, he attended the monthly HOA meeting, where he hoped to see community support. But as soon as he brought up the issue, Karen, the HOA president, interrupted him with a patronizing smile. "Ethan, I think you're making too much of this," she said, her voice syrupy sweet but sharp underneath. "Sharing water between neighbors is just part of being a good community member. We don't need to turn everything into a drama." Ethan stared at her in disbelief. Karen was well known for her controlling, condescending attitude, but siding with Todd so quickly was a punch in the gut. "You're saying stealing is okay?" he asked, trying to keep his voice level. Karen waved her hand dismissively. "Stealing is a strong word. You have so much, and it's just water. Maybe you should focus on being a bit more neighborly." Todd, sitting smugly a few rows behind her, shot Ethan a wink. Ethan clenched his jaw, the sense of injustice settling deep in his bones. This wasn't just about water anymore. It was about principle. And it was clear that if he wanted justice, he was going to have to fight both Todd's arrogance and Karen's blind favoritism. Ethan left that HOA meeting simmering with frustration. Karen's condescension echoed in his mind all evening, her dismissive tone and patronizing smile making it clear that she had no intention of holding Todd accountable. It wasn't just favoritism, it was enabling. But Ethan knew better than to lash out publicly. Instead, he doubled down. He reviewed every piece of evidence he'd collected, carefully documenting dates and times. He even set up motion sensors and additional cameras near the well, making sure that if Todd continued his theft, it would be undeniable. Late that night, just after midnight, the sensors pinged on Ethan's phone. He slipped on his shoes, grabbed his binoculars, and stepped quietly out onto his porch. Across the fence, in the faint glow of patio lights, he could see Todd lounging once again, beer in hand, laughing with someone. Ethan strained to hear. The other voice belonged to Chad, another neighbor known for being friendly but not exactly sharp. Todd's voice carried across the yard, slurred slightly from the beer. "Dude, I've been using Ethan's well for months. The guy didn't even notice until last week." Chad let out a low whistle. "Seriously? That's wild." But then Todd said something that made Ethan's breath catch. "Not just using it, man. Selling it. Remember Mrs. Whitaker down the road? Her well dried up last summer. I've been helping her out, for a little cash on the side. Easy money." Ethan froze. Selling stolen water. This wasn't just petty theft anymore, it was fraud, exploitation, and deceit on a scale he hadn't imagined. Mrs. Whitaker, a sweet elderly woman who could barely carry her groceries, was being taken advantage of by this smug con artist. Ethan's heart pounded with a mix of fury and excitement. This was far bigger than a neighborhood squabble. The next morning, Ethan wasted no time. He updated his report to the Water Authority, detailing Todd's admission and the fraudulent sale. He attached audio snippets captured by his outdoor mics and explained the scale of what he had uncovered. He half expected bureaucracy to slow things down, but the response was swift. The agent on the phone assured him the investigation would be escalated. Selling stolen water was a criminal offense. Todd's cockiness was about to collide with reality. But what Ethan hadn't counted on was how deep the rot went. 2 days later, he caught sight of Karen and Todd in whispered conversation near the community garden. She was smiling, her body language relaxed, while Todd gestured with an exaggerated grin. Ethan crept closer, staying out of sight. Karen's voice drifted toward him, soft but clear. "Just keep my yard looking good, Todd, and I don't see a reason to stir up trouble. You scratch my back, I scratch yours." Ethan's stomach turned. Karen had known. She had known all along and was benefiting from the stolen water, lawn care, favors, and God knows what else in exchange for her silence. That explained her dismissive attitude, her public defense of Todd, and her quickness to label Ethan's concerns as drama. When Ethan got home that night, there was a letter from the HOA on his doorstep. He opened it and read in disbelief. He was being fined for unsightly equipment installation, his security cameras, and unneighborly conduct, a vague and infuriating accusation clearly meant as retaliation. The fine wasn't small either. Karen was using her position to punish him for standing up against her golden boy. Ethan's hands trembled with rage. But instead of tearing up the letter, he placed it carefully on his desk, took photos, and added them to his growing file of evidence. This wasn't just about stolen water anymore. It was corruption, manipulation, and abuse of power. And Ethan was going to expose them both. The following week felt like an eternity for Ethan. Every morning, he checked his cameras, confirming what he already knew: Todd hadn't stopped. The hose remained connected, water steadily siphoning into that ridiculous above-ground pool. The arrogance was staggering, but it was Karen's complicity that gnawed at him most. Her smug face at the HOA meeting, her private deal with Todd, and the retaliatory fine all pointed to the same conclusion: they both believed they were untouchable. Ethan was determined to prove them wrong. Then, on a bright Thursday afternoon, it finally happened. From his kitchen window, Ethan spotted a pair of white SUVs pulling up in front of Todd's house. The decals on the doors read County Water Enforcement, and stepping out behind them was a uniformed local officer. Ethan set down his coffee, heart racing with anticipation, and quietly stepped out onto his porch, arms crossed as he watched the scene unfold. Todd opened the door with his usual laid-back swagger, but it didn't last long. The officials wasted no time, showing their badges and beginning to question him right there on the porch. Ethan couldn't hear every word, but Todd's exaggerated shrugs and half-smiles told him everything he needed to know. He was trying to play dumb. The group moved around the side of the house toward the backyard, where the evidence sat in plain sight. One of the inspectors followed the hose from Todd's pool, across the yard, and right to the fence line. Without hesitation, the official gestured toward Ethan's property and then turned back to Todd with a raised brow. That was Ethan's moment. He stepped forward, standing at his side of the fence. "Sir," Ethan called out calmly, "that hose is connected to my private well without my permission. I have documented evidence of ongoing theft and unauthorized use." The inspector waved him over. Ethan handed over a printed packet, photos, time-stamped videos, audio recordings, and a detailed timeline of events. Todd's face turned pale, his cocky demeanor crumbling as the inspector flipped through the pages. And then the hammer really dropped. The inspector turned to Todd and said in a firm voice, "We've also received reports that you've been selling this stolen water to other residents. Is that true?" Todd's eyes went wide. "What? No. I was just helping out neighbors." Ethan couldn't resist. Helping them, for cash. The inspector didn't even blink. You'll have the opportunity to explain that in court. Todd stammered, eyes darting between Ethan and the officials, desperately searching for an escape route. Come on, guys, it's just water. I didn't steal money. That's when the officer, who had remained silent until now, stepped forward. Actually, sir, selling stolen resources is a crime. You might want to contact a lawyer. Todd sagged like a balloon deflating. But Ethan wasn't done. He took a breath and added, and I believe the HOA president, Karen, was aware of this activity and chose to ignore it for personal favors. The inspector's head snapped up. Is that true? He asked Todd. Todd hesitated, then muttered, I don't know. The inspector turned toward Karen's house and scribbled furiously on his clipboard. We'll be looking into that. Karen must have seen the commotion from her window because, moments later, she marched over, her expression tight with forced politeness. Officers, is there an issue here? The inspector didn't sugarcoat. We have multiple reports and confirmed evidence of unauthorized water use and fraudulent sales. We've also received allegations of HOA negligence and possible complicity. Karen's mask didn't crack, not even then. She lifted her chin and said smoothly, I was only trying to promote community harmony. Sometimes rules need flexibility for the greater good. The inspector's cold stare said everything. You'll be receiving an official inquiry notice. We take these matters seriously. Karen's smile faltered, but she still didn't apologize. Ethan stood there, watching both of them unravel, and for the first time in weeks, he felt the weight start to lift. In the days that followed, the fallout hit hard. Todd's reputation shattered almost overnight. The story spread faster than wildfire, neighbors whispering on sidewalks and laughing behind closed doors. Soon, the nickname stuck, Water Baron Todd. Every time someone's garden hose leaked or a sprinkler malfunctioned, someone would crack a joke, should we call Todd? Maybe he's running a side business. Even the local hardware store jumped in, putting up a sign in their window that read, Water hoses for legal use only, sorry, Todd. Ethan couldn't have written a better ending if he tried. But the real satisfaction came when Karen's carefully polished facade began to crumble. The county opened an official investigation into HOA misconduct, and word spread that she had been using her position to protect Todd in exchange for personal favors. Residents who had once nodded politely to her in meetings now avoided her altogether. Mrs. Whitaker, the elderly neighbor Todd had taken advantage of, confronted Karen on the street in front of half the neighborhood, waving her cane and demanding to know how she could possibly turn a blind eye to theft that hurt her most. Karen tried to respond, but the words died on her lips, her usual smugness replaced by pale silence. Todd, desperate to cover his mounting fines, sold the very pool he'd been so desperate to fill. Seeing that empty patch of dead grass in his backyard was pure poetic justice. Karen, meanwhile, tried to save face by sending out a community email, full of empty platitudes about understanding and forgiveness. No one replied. No one cared. Her power had slipped through her fingers, and the neighborhood made sure she knew it. Ethan didn't need revenge, reality had taken care of that for him. He simply returned to his porch, coffee in hand, water pressure finally strong and steady, and enjoyed the quiet. Justice had been served. The thief and the enabler both exposed, their arrogance brought low. But he couldn't help but wonder how many other neighborhoods had their own Todds and Karens getting away with more than they should. Have you ever felt powerless against HOA rules, or found yourself at the mercy of a Karen? Share your experiences below, let's see who had it worse.